Automobility, one of my favorite topics, and not for the reasons you might think. One of the most difficult things about teaching the history and theory of architecture is to get over the simplistic idea that the built environment is a passive reflection of our values. Is it a passive reflection of our values? Yes. Is it just a passive reflection of our values? No. It actually changes. It plays an active role. Some people would use the word agency. I'm a little hesitant about using that word, and it's a little too fancy pants for this discussion. So, but think about what that might mean. How many people went to high school? So you understand what it's like to be subjected to social forces, what it's like to either be embarrassed or whatever the opposite of embarrassed is. What is it? Proud or hey, look at me, aren't I great? Right? And there is no more powerful force of signal of winning and losing in our society at this moment in time, or up very close to the present moment of time, than the car. How can you tell who's the winner and who's the loser? Winners drive fancy cars. Losers wait for the bus. We know this without anyone ever telling us this. Watch television commercials for about 30 seconds. If you've been raised in a box your entire life, within 30 seconds of coming out of the box, this is one of the first and most profound lessons of life. You are either a winner or a loser. And one of the biggest indicators of winning and losing is the car. So it's a remarkable demonstration that we all experience once we start thinking about it, of how the built environment is anything but passive. It exerts an enormous pressure on us in very significant and powerful ways. It structures our reality. So think about that. Back in the late 19th century, we're going to backtrack slightly and move very quickly through this material. Back in the late 19th century, as cities started to become places of expanding economic energy, where do all the people live? We don't necessarily want to live in these dense places anymore. What is it that relieved us first and foremost from the dense, packed conditions of the industrial city that were so deplorable? The streetcar. Did cities and governments build the streetcar? No. I'm a land developer. I buy land outside of what was a city. Let's call it Brookline. Let's call it Roxbury. Let's call it Dorchester. Let's call it any neighborhood other than the Back Bay. Anything beyond the Back Bay and even South Boston. I buy some land. What is it worth? I buy it really cheap. It's agricultural land. It's worth next to nothing. I get it really cheap. What do? How do I get people to want to spend a much higher price to purchase that land or housing on that land? Step number one, I build a streetcar. I build a streetcar from downtown Boston to a street that I lay out that cuts through the center of my land. There might be the post road that runs to Providence or out to Framingham. So these routes, like Huntington Avenue, all of these routes are already fairly major regional connectors. I'm going to buy land adjacent to those connectors. I'm going to fund a streetcar line. It's a private enterprise. My land development company owns this streetcar line. And as soon as there's a streetcar line, I'm going to build triple deckers out as within a half a mile to a mile of that streetcar line. And that's how Los Angeles develops. Los Angeles was a desert. Step one, bring water in and make it agriculturally rich. Step two, plant lots of palm trees and pretend that that's the way it always was. There were no palm trees in Los Angeles. It was a real estate development scheme. Step three, build a streetcar to this really cheap agricultural land and then build housing on the blocks. Here you see the grid pattern of the original LA shifting to the north, south, east, west grid pattern of the Jeffersonian grid, and you see the streetcar lines. Now notice the pattern of streetcar lines. They tend to favor these major streets and create these residential districts that are all within walking distance of a shopping street and a streetcar line. So the streetcar lines would be on here. These are the shopping streets where buses would run, and the streetcar lines. And so this is the way every city in the world developed from the late 19th century into the 1920s. At the end of the 1920s, you have the Great Depression globally, and there's not much building going on. And so there's a lull until after World War II. So there's a 15-year lull in construction. But the big spurt of urbanization occurred according to this pattern everywhere. And between the towns, there was intercity rail. Los Angeles in the 1920s had the most mass transit in the world. It had the most highly developed mass transit system in the world. What happened? We'll get to that. Mass production of automobiles started in 1907 with Henry Ford. The only people who had to have cars are doctors, so you can get to patients in their homes, house calls. For everyone else, it was a luxury. It was for drives around in the park. Corbusier loved the logic of the automobile and celebrated it, and was very inspired by this kind of a vision where the infrastructure of transportation becomes an architectural spine. This was back in the time when architects were interested in cities and infrastructure systems and designed it. This was one of the first parkways, high-speed, segregated traffic. This is only for cars. Corbusier said, let's make a freeway along the coast of Algiers, Algeria. It was a French colony at the time, so we can control everything that happens there because we have the political power. He proposed these buildings where the rooftops of the buildings were for cars. This is all parking on the roof. This major roadway is the access to the Capitol building on the water. And this is a residential slab with a freeway on the top, very similar to this idea. And then he traveled to Latin America, and he proposed similar things for the cities of Latin America. Notice that he's replacing the old city fabric with new fabric with raised high-speed road transportation. And he proposes this for Buenos Aires and other cities throughout Latin America. Here's an illustration of the raised roadways that leave the ground plane free for gardens and humans. And here, with the shadows, you start to get a sense of how these radon pattern of housing slabs leaves the ground plane liberated completely for humans. Corbusier toyed with the design of interchanges. So did Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright even went so far as to design cars. This was an interchange proposed by Frank Lloyd Wright. I think there'd be kind of a mess. But his visions, his architectural visions of the 1930s, like Corbusier, incorporated ideas about how we would travel in the future. These awesome-looking cars, and, yes, my personal favorite flying car idea. And here it is parked on a balcony, and this is the landscape. Very low density. Broadacre City, 1934, was his idea of every household had an acre of land to farm and raise. Very low density, made possible by personal vehicular transportation. 1939, the Futurama exhibit at the World's Fair in New York predicted with great precision the future of cities around the world. This was a radical vision. This was a huge model, bigger than Annex Central, and people were taken around on train tracks to look down at the model. This is actually what has been built all over the world. It looks almost exactly like Dubai. And at the center was the General Motors auditorium. The pedestrians are raised up over the roadways. The other architect that I mentioned previously, who was one of the most influential designers of the 20th century, he flunked out of architecture school but became very powerful as the Führer of Nazi Germany, yes, Adolf Hitler invented the freeway and proposed a freeway system across Germany. This is 1936, thus beating the United States to the punch. This is a similar proposal for the New York City area by a man by the name of Robert Moses. And if any of you who grew up in New York City? No one. New York City is an example of a completely transformed landscape by the vision of one man. This is not the Garden State, but the New York State Thruway. Robert Moses had a long career, many decades long. He was the most powerful man to never be elected to power. He transformed the state of New York. The Empire State became the Empire State because of his infrastructure projects. He had the backing of the president, Lindsay, the Rockefellers, everybody. The whole idea of slum clearance, urban freeways, that was the big question. The interstate freeway system was established in the 1950s by the Interstate Freeway Act by President Eisenhower. But the real question was, would the freeways influence the cities? Robert Moses said absolutely, and influence it he did. It was a combination of slum clearance that we call urban renewal. Whenever you use the term urban renewal from now on, you should understand that that is a historically specific term. It refers to the policy of destroying American cities to a level comparable to the bombing raids of Europe of World War II. As much or more of American cities was destroyed by urban renewal. It was comparable to the destruction of Europe. But we did it on purpose at great expense to ourselves. We built the World's Fair Pavilion in New York, Jones Beach, lots of parking. Robert Moses is accused of making the overpasses of the freeways leading to Jones Beach too small for buses, so only rich people could go there. There is a lot of racism in all of this. In World War II, we didn't have much of a chance of winning, but we did something tricky. We industrialized faster than anyone had ever industrialized before. At the end of World War II, what do you do with all that industrial capacity? We have all these factories that built all the tanks and planes that won the war. Now what? Let's make automobility the big consumer push of the post-war years. And to do that, we built an interstate highway system. We established the mortgage policy that meant that if you wanted to live in the city and stay in the city, tough luck. It's really hard. We're not going to offer you any money to improve your housing in the city. But for less money that you pay in rent, we will allow you to purchase a brand new house in the suburbs for very low money down and less money per month than you're currently paying in rent. And you get this open space, clean air, and if you want to stay, you have to tolerate the disinvestment in schools. So your school quality is going to plummet. We're going to have a new tax base in the suburbs with excellent schools. And anyone who wants to move out of the city, we're going to make it really easy for you. It's crazy not to move out of the city. If you stay in the city, you're either insane or not white. Because it's illegal to buy a house in the suburbs unless you're white. Until a very recent moment in time, it was fine. It was business as usual to say only white people can live here. 1965 is when that changed. Traveling the country by car became the cultural badge of honor and distinction. It's the right way to see the United States. Has anyone done it? It's true, isn't it? It's a great way to experience the United States. It's easy to mistake what I'm saying as the automobile is evil. The reason the automobile is such a problem for us in the 21st century is because it was so over-the-top successful. It did everything it aspired to do and more. It is incredible. It's the most powerful transportation machine system ever devised by humanity. But it has also been the #1 contributor to planetary death, to social segregation, to the devastation of our cities. Automobile ownership in the United States skyrocketed like nobody else in the world, and hit in the mid-90s, came close to 800 vehicles per 1,000 people population. And in the mid-90s, this chart shows where other countries are. At that point, India had 6 cars per 1,000 people. China had 5 cars per 1,000 people. Bangladesh had 1 car per 1,000 people. Indonesia had something comparable to China and India. Now, I'm mentioning those because those are the highest population countries in the world. The United States is number 3, China is number 1, India number 2, Indonesia number 4. And those numbers since 1995, wasn't that long ago, 20 years ago. China, India, and Indonesia are all climbing rapidly on this scale. It no longer matters, and this is the lecture for next week, it no longer really matters what the United States does. It's pretty good. This is working pretty good, this automobile thing, pretty good. But other places, it's a little different. The automobile as a cultural icon became very important, but it's extremely inefficient spatially. Some people say, planetary death, we can fix that. Market forces, technological advancement will reduce the emissions of cars, increase the mileage statistics. If you ignore the fact that electricity comes from coal and oil, you can say it's emission-free when you go to all electrical vehicles. But you can't really ignore the fact that electricity doesn't come from clean sources yet. This is some of the spatial consequences. People who argue that the technology is going to fix all the problems of the car are ignoring the fact that no matter how clean the car gets, when a car burns with perfection, it still releases carbon dioxide. That's actually the goal. The only thing you're cleaning up with the emissions is you're reducing the carbon monoxide that will make you sick immediately, and the sulfurs and all of those other things. When it becomes perfectly clean, 100% clean, the only thing it emits is carbon dioxide and water vapor. Water vapor? Okay. Carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide is about to become subject to EPA rules. So carbon dioxide is the big criminal in the planetary death thing. But set that aside, it's about space. We're an architecture school. It's also about space. The logic that we all know from early childhood is when there's not enough parking, build more parking. When there's too much traffic congestion, widen the roads. It's obvious. As soon as the first freeway was built from LA to Pasadena, someone noticed that the amount of driving went up. This is called induced demand. Induced demand results in things like this. You can widen the roads and increase the parking, but that simply increases the demand for driving and parking. And so if you keep following this logic, you end up with the situation in Houston, which is about 85% of the land area of central Houston is for driving on roads and for parking. Only 15% is left for the actual uses. And it's not a very positive situation. It turns out, sorry these are so small, that cars take up a lot of space. This is what those cars look like if it's just the drivers. Now, if you could put all those people in a bus, it takes up a lot smaller. And if you had mixed traffic, it's already way better. The good news is all you have to do is shift a few people out of the cars, and there's a huge increase in the road capacity. Similarly, architecturally, it used to be that in the owner's best interest, they would maximize the lot coverage and make the biggest store they can. But then free parking rules require them to have a certain number of parking spaces. And so the usable area goes down dramatically. And every few years, they increase the parking requirement, like they did in Brookline a few years ago. And you end up with a mere shadow of the utility that you used to have. Plus, the distance between places increases. When someone wants to build an office building, you calculate more or less 350 square feet per employee, and that counts for all the elevators, bathrooms, corridors, cafes, conference rooms, everything, not just the cubicles. So 350 square feet per employee. Now, it makes a difference whether this office facility is in a city, serviced by walking and transportation, public transportation, or in an office park. If it's in an office park, you have to add how much space for a car? 450 square feet per car. And it's very difficult to stack that space. It turns out that the denser the city, the lower the impact in terms of energy usage. So the most high-density cities like Hong Kong, Seoul, Manila have the lowest energy impacts, and the less the density is, the higher the energy impact. So people who look at cities and say they're dirty, they're polluted, they're not environmentally sound, it's actually the opposite. The per-person expenditure is much lower as the high density goes up. The worst place in the United States is Wyoming, where the density is the lowest. So here's the image of success that we've created. It's changed a little bit now. You guys seem to favor small electronic devices as the status symbol indicators, and cars not so much anymore. And so, let's see. The physical situation of all this spreading out over the landscape, something we call sprawl, causes very negative experiences on the ground. If this were a bigger image, what you would see is a family scrambling across this road, desperately trying to keep their children alive. This is the experience that says, in case you weren't paying attention, whoever doesn't drive is a loser, and it's irresponsible. It's putting their families at risk. But this is changing, and this is the last bit. Donald Appleyard did a study comparing two streets, one with heavy traffic, and he used architectural drawing to track the number of social connections that were documented on this block. And so he identified in heavy traffic situations, he quantified it, 0.9 friends per person and 3.1 acquaintances per person. Then he looked at one block over at where the traffic was lighter in San Francisco. And he found 3 friends per person and 6.3 acquaintances on that block. This is on the block. So the amount of traffic on the block has a huge impact on the social viability of the place. The strange thing that is happening now that no one expected is that the trend of driving more and more and more every year has been broken. A 10% decrease in the amount of driving in the United States. Here's the cost of gasoline against how many miles per year the average American drives. It went up and up, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, kind of a crash, economic crash, drop in gas prices, ever increasing. It seems like it's going to go up forever. But something weird happens around 2010. Things start to turn around, and now we have lower and lower driving mileage per person. And the real estate markets are now using walkability scores for neighborhoods to establish market value of housing. The higher the walkability of the neighborhood, the higher the value of the housing. And so it's really changing. The last slide is a foreshadowing of the next lecture, which is about what I hinted at previously. Whatever the United States does, 4% of the global population, it really doesn't matter anymore. It's trivial. We are nobody in terms of population, except how it influences what China, India, and the rest of Asia does, because that's 50% of humanity. If they follow the model we've set so far, we're in deep doo-doo. But if we have a brief moment of cultural power, soft power in the United States, where if we find a better way to do things, it might influence them, and we might have a chance to turn this bus around. Thank you very much.